Yeah, so this is part two. As Adrian said, it's a sort of a double feature. This is now that you suffered through a lot of equations and a lot of Feynman diagrams, you can now suffer through a lot of plots. So I'm going to talk exclusively about plots and results. So as I said, Adrian talked about methods, and I'm going to talk about results. And before I start talking about results, let me talk about what we have. And what we have is we have 6+ processes at NNLO. And these 6 processes are muon decay. Adrian showed some plots for the muon decay. It's Epa Scattering and EE to mu mu. The former we already have for quite a while, for at least parts of it. The other one is currently in process. I do that with a student of mine. Then we have EP and mu scattering. Only the electronic contributions at present, or I suppose with a point light proton. We have ENU scattering. That was originally just a test, and then it turned out people are interested. So it now becomes more than a test. We have Baba and Möller scattering, so EE and E plus E minus. And we have EE to gamma gamma. Some of these things you see have a sharp next to them, and that means they are complete except for some hadronic effects. That means like they aren't publishable as completely yet, but they are mostly done, and we can, at least in some cases, fix them relatively quickly. So because people, I mean, as you said, you tried to download the code, it didn't work. So let's briefly talk about the code. This is the URL, you can go there and download it, and then you can compile the /configure and make, and it should work. If it doesn't, come talk to me. As Adrian said, you can define any observable. You can go ahead, write down an observable, can be as complicated as you want, as long as it's definable, inference safe as a function of momenta. So we give you a bunch of 4 momenta, and you tell us, I want that event, I don't want that event, and I want to histogram the energy, or I want to histogram some detector response, I want to histogram God only knows what. As long as you can write that in a computer file, in this case a Fortran file, but you can link it to C if you want, it works. Then you have to run quite a few pieces. The physics is split across many different sub pieces to improve things. And on the right here, you see a tree of things that you have to do, and it looks quite daunting, but you just read the manual. The manual says, okay, for this process, you need these pieces, and then you run these pieces. And there's systematics behind there. So this F bit is the one loop virtual, the R bit is the NLO real correction with one real photon. And this is the thing Adrian very briefly mentioned with the partitioning, then the 2 loop, the real virtual, and the real. It doesn't really matter. As the end user, you don't need to know what these things are. You just need to have the list of things that you have to run, and then you run them, and then that's that. I'm going to show this is for LP scattering. So it's muon proton to muon proton. And we call LP scattering muon proton scattering because this code was written at PSI. And yeah, you can plot the results with Python, and it is Python 3. In my notebook, I only have Python 3. It might be that something isn't quite merged in the public version. And in the interest of open science, every result, but I really mean every result, is public on our GitLab, and that includes the definition of the observable. So if you want to run the code and have no idea where to start, you go there, you look at our papers, find something you find interesting, take that observable and implement that, and then you run that, and then you start tweaking it. So we try to make it really easy for people to use. And you'll see throughout the talk, I have a bunch of links like this. If you download the PDF from the Indico, you can click them and view the plots online or view the source files online. And yeah, you can also type them in if you prefer that, of course. So this is an example of how an observable is defined. This is for EP scattering. And again, this is the link. And what you have to define is, so you have how many distributions you want, how many histograms. In this example, I have 1 because this slide is only that big. You have to define how many bins each histogram has. So 200, because why not? It starts somewhere, it stops somewhere. So 25 and 45, I think, degrees it is. And then you define a function. It takes a bunch of 4 vectors, and then you can boost them to the center of mass frame or something, or boost them so that they are given in the center of mass frame, but then if you want them in the lab frame, you just boost them into the lab frame. And then you make a cut. So for example, I want theta E to be bigger than 25 degrees, but smaller than 45. So if it's not those things, you just say, no, it doesn't pass my cuts. And then you histogram it. So you have a histogram, you plot theta E, and you plot theta E. And then you run that, and then you get a plot for theta E. We try to make it as easy to use as possible. If you have questions, just let us know. We can help you. Yeah, so before we do electron proton scattering or things people might find interesting from a physics point of view, I need to convince you why you should believe us. Adrian told you that we have some approximations and we have these techniques we stole from QCD and whatnot. Why should you believe any of this? And I hope to convince you on the next 2 slides that you should, that we know what we're doing and that it works. So for this, we look at the Miona decay, which is a really, really detailed study process. And we look at first some NNLO approximation. So people calculated the Miona decay at NNLO 2002, and they've done the logs. So alpha square log ME over mu square and log alpha square log ME over mu. A few years later, someone did a numerical loop integration of this and had the full result as a numerical plot. And then we had the first NNLO calculation in 2018, and that was mostly just to test everything. It was the same setup we're going to use for everything else, but now we can test, does this work? And the answer is yes. This is currently averaged over neutrinos, but we are currently, because we don't care about the neutrinos, but some people do. So we're currently redoing this calculation with a student to fix that, to not average over neutrinos. And this is what it looks like. You can see and I also show this plot to explain you how I'm going to plot things. So in the upper panel, you see the branching ratio as a function of x. X is the energy of the electron with respect to the muon. So it goes from 0 to 1. Doesn't matter what it is in detail. It's the energy of the electron. And you see in the upper panel, this at leading order in green. And you actually can see that there's a green curve. So that's nice. So there are different curves in this plot. And on top of that, I plot in red the NNLO. And like the questions aren't frightfully big, but that's not the point. The point is like we can do this. In this panel, I show what's called the K factor. The K factor is NNLO in this case over leading order. And there's an analytic calculation of that from Andrei Abutsov from 2001. And you can see that perfectly. Because we have a histogram because we have a Monte Carlo, so we have to histogram things. He did an analytic calculation, but you can see it. But I don't have to convince you that this shows agreement. This is the K factor, the differential K factor. It's not just K factor times previous result, because then it would be flat. It really is a differential K factor at NLO, and then we have the K factor at NNLO. And this plot is a bit busier. In red, you see the McMule result, or rather you see a bit of McMule result and then the legend, which is a bit unfortunately placed. And I want you to focus mostly on the high energy tail here, because that's the bit that's more interesting. Because we can compare to the result from Abutsov, which is the leading log approximation. And you see that it agrees quite well as soon as the energy is high. That's to be expected. This approximation is really rubbish for low energy electrons, because the approximation essentially assumes the electron is massless, or rather the electron is massless at smaller scale in the process. And if the electron energy is an MEV, the electron mass is no longer the smallest scale in the process because the energy momentum is. So that approximation is really rubbish for low energies, as you'd expect. This was fixed in 2005 by Anastasia et al., where they've calculated things numerically. And you see this, the red line goes perfectly through the McMule result. And this, I hope convinces you that we know what we're doing, that this method works that Adrian talked about. This is massification, this is the subtraction scheme, it just works. And now we can do some other things. We can do the neutrino spectrum, for example. This is currently just NLO. We are working on the NNLO, and there was supposed to be a statement here that it doesn't work yet, but that got moved off by me changing the slide format. I suppose that's cheeky for me. This is the electron neutrino spectrum, and Alexander Tomalak has calculated this, and we agree perfectly. there's nothing really else to say. We agree. It's an NNLO calculation. It's on our side. There's nothing fancy going on. The NNLO currently suffers from numerical issues, and Adrian mentioned some of them, and some methods we have to address them. They don't quite work with it because it's polarized, but it's doable. We've done it before. We've done it here. The fact that we average over the neutrinos can't fundamentally change things, and we were just unlucky, I suppose, and we'll fix it. Okay, cool. Adrian showed things for muon E, or rather mu-E scattering. And the reason we care about mu-E scattering is the Miona experiment. And I mean, you all know about G-2 and the hadronic vacuum polarizations and whatnot, and like usually lattice or data or whatever, don't care. What matters for this talk is the Miona experiment. The idea is to take a 150 GeV muon beam, shoot it at a target. I think the target is beryllium, and scatter it off the electrons of the atomic beryllium. And then measure angles, because they can't measure energy. They just measure angles, and then you'll try to reconstruct the Q-square, which is a game we all know how to do, or rather maybe not. And then you take this data, you use it to extract the running of alpha, because you measure essentially this diagram, which is in the logo, muon electron scattering, and you measure this diagram, which is the O, and then you can integrate that to get G-2. The target precision of this experiment is 10 to the -5 relative, and relative here means signal region versus background region. And that means the target precision for theory is also 10 to the -5, and that means definitely NNLO, almost definitely the most important bits of the n-cubed LO. It definitely means parton show. It probably means a bunch of other things we haven't thought about yet. And there's a white paper from the muon theory initiative that is a fancy name for a bunch of theorists. And yeah, we try to do this calculation, and we are getting there. This started, and I only show papers that are directly related to muon E, because muon electron scattering is one of the basic processes. People have calculated that since forever. So these are only things that are connected to muon E. People have done the full electroweak NNLO, including QED, obviously, and that's the most important bit, but they've done electroweak as well, just so to make sure it doesn't matter, and it doesn't, so that's nice. Hadronic corrections are under control. People have looked both at new physics contamination and found it to be not important, and then still, can we use this to find new physics? And these are just a bunch of papers. There are more, because it's new physics, and there's always a lot of papers on it. The dominant NNLO was calculated by us and a different group in Pavia, 2020. Just when COVID hit, we find agreement, and we did find agreement. Everything works, everything's nice. Pair production and fermion loops are taken care of, so you can consider muon electron scattering, and that you produce an electron positron pair, or a muon anti-muon pair, or a pion pair, or whatnot, all calculated. Most of it doesn't matter, but it's calculated, so that's fine. The same for fermion loops. So people have considered closed fermion loops, both hadron and leptons, all accounted for. The two-loop calculation has been completed earlier this year with electron mass equals 0. And you see the number of people here. I hope this gives you an idea of how complicated this calculation is. And this is essentially the 2-photon exchange and 3-photon exchange, but with a point-like muon, because that's a muon that's point-like. But it's an extremely difficult calculation, and it's only very recently been completed. Okay, let's go through the results. This is the dominant contribution, and what I plot here is in the upper panel. Again, I plot the cross-section. So this is in nanobound for reasons, and it goes up as a function of, so this is cross-section as a function of theta E, of the electron scattering angle. And it's extremely boosted, so that the angle is relatively small, and then it sort of goes up and drops. At LO, that's just a line, and that's trivial. And at NNLO, it is still a line, and it's not quite as trivial. But yeah, that's just what the cross-section looks like. It gets corrected quite a lot. But most of these corrections are due to the NNLO, and that's the middle panel on the left. You see the NNLO K factor. So again, I remind you, this is next to leading order over leading order. And that's quite large. So here, at very low scattering angle, the corrections are huge. The corrections are a factor of 4. So the matrix, like the cross-section changes by a factor of 4. But that's not really surprising. That's just soft photon emission that just kicks the electron towards smaller scattering angles. And it's something we can control. This is what Proton showers are invented for. And it sort of then peters off to something reasonable for larger scattering angles. On the right-hand side, you see the NNLO K factor. And that is still in the same units, but now it's not 4, now it's 2%. And that suggests that we actually will get there eventually. This is the dominant NNLO, it's not the full NNLO. It's essentially the electronic correction. So it's just, or rather the electronic corrections if you think electron proton scattering. And to again convince you that we know what we're doing, I'll point you to the lowest panel, and that's the comparison us versus Pavia. And we agree within 0.5 nanobarns. And if you look at the upper panel again, the total scale is 10,000 nanobarns. So we agree within the numerical error. I didn't plot this relative because it has a bunch of zero crossing and it just looks rubbish. So I plotted absolute numbers. Okay, cool. Now for the first time, and this is a world premiere, this is the full next to leading order calculation for muon electron scattering. It's absolutely everything. And it's quite a busy plot. And Tim Engel, who isn't in the audience, I think, made this for his PhD, and then we made it a bunch of time because I kept nagging him that I wanted slightly differently formatted and whatnot. So this is now in microbarns because I forgot to nag Tim about that, but who cares? Let's talk about it again. Top panel, same as before. Looks slightly different, but it's the same as before. Middle panel on the left is the NNLO K factor, and there's, sorry, this is a slightly different observable. This has just a cut on the angle of the electron, and this has cuts also on the muon angle. I can't remember on the top of my head what they are. I can look it up if you're interested. So this is why they don't agree perfectly. But the point still holds. So the NNLO K factor is quite large, and as you can see from this, here the blue line, that's the electronic correction. So that's just stuff that happens to the electron. It's the one photon exchange contributions in the language of LP scattering. And then you see in orange, you see a tiny sliver of a thing there. That's the 2 photon exchange contribution with a point like muon. Yeah. And you also have, just for completeness, the muon side, that's against 1 photon exchange, but the other way around. So the electron just has a 1 photon exchange, and then the muon has corrections. And that's really, really, really tiny. And that's essentially the reason why I could show you this plot and not be ashamed of myself, because if we say at NNLO it looks the same, I've shown you essentially this line at NNLO earlier. On the right-hand side, that's the pink line, that's the hadronic vacuum polarization, and that's the signal. It's really large at small scattering angle and then sort of drops off. Because we don't care particularly about muon, I'm not going to talk about that much more. Let's talk instead about the lower panel, and that's the new bit. We have in blue, again, the electronic corrections, and that's next to leading order, and they're 2 per mil-ish. And that means if you want per mil level accuracy, you need next to leading order. There's no way around that. If you want 2 per mil, use the code, it's there. Electronic is a blue, not quite large. Then we have the mixed contribution. These are the new ones. And they are still reasonably large. This is now, again, I remind you, this is 2 photon and 3 photon exchange. And they can matter even for 4.8 particle. They're obviously not as large as the electronic stuff, but still quite large. In red, you see only the vacuum polarization. So that's closed electron loops, closed muon loops, closed tau loops, closed top loops, not really, but in principle, closed everything loops, closed pion loops, hadronic, everything. And that's plotted separately because we can do this with full mass dependence. And Adrian skipped that out of time reasons, and I'm going to skip it as well, again, out of time reasons. But now I hope you saw that we know what we're doing, and we especially understand Miona scattering. So let's talk about EP scattering, or I suppose MuP scattering. And I'm going to talk mostly about the electronic equations. And what we're going to do is we're going to parameterize the proton as a form factor. So it's no longer a point-like proton, it's this proton. So it has an F1 and an F2. And obviously, if you set F1 to 1 and F2 to 0, that's Miona scattering, except with different masses. And MuE scattering is extremely well checked. So yeah, unfortunately, there is a discrepancy with the previous calculations from Hubert and his PhD student. We've compared that we agree on the matrix element, and we know, because we know that if we take everything and set F1 to 1 and F2 to 0, we agree with the Pavia group. And yeah, yeah, that's what I said. And I'm going to show you now results for MESA and Muse. I just picked random energies. If you want different energies, come talk to us and we can do different energies. And we actually have some results for different energies. And obviously, proper 2PE is work in progress. Okay, cool. Results. This is for MESA. It's a beam energy of 155 MeV. It's just what Hubert used in his paper. I have absolutely no idea if it's realistic. If it's not, we can do something else. This is a week of running. If you want something else, we do something else. Same plots as before, and they're not, I don't know, they're not as wavy as before. So I'm just going to go relatively quickly through them. We have a cut on the electron, outgoing electron energy. It's a plot as a function of theta E in degrees, scattering angle. And yeah, upper panel, again, leading order next to leading order. Sorry, next to leading order. And lower panels are the various K factors. And we've split those into things that are vacuum polarization and things that aren't. That's quite artificial, and it's just something we do because we can. In the paper, there was a point for that, but not really here. So it's, yeah, if you don't care about how the calculation works, just look at the solid lines. In this configuration, we have 5% NNLO corrections-ish, and per mil, I remind you 10 to the -3 here, per millish NNLO corrections. And so yeah, I would because again the kinematic changes, I can find configurations where this is as large as you want it to be. So please do take these things into account. MuP scattering, random energy to 210 MeV, scattering angle 20 to 100 degrees. If you want something else, just come talk to us. This essentially is the proof of concept. What we plot here is so we are single differential always. If we want double differential, it needs many more points, obviously, because Monte Carlo. So what we did as a compromise was calculate the energy, the kinetic energy of the outgoing muon for different values of theta. So we take theta mu and say between 22 and 44 degrees, between 46 and 62. And I have absolutely no idea how Adrian got these values. He just picked them at some point. I think there was a reason for that, but I can't remember.
Nice, Jason. It's a purely optical reason.
Okay, it's a purely optical reason. This plot looks pretty then. So you see here, for low-ish scattering angle, you get high energy muon, but you see that it peters off, and this is the radiative tail we've heard so much about. But now it's not just the radiative tail, it's the radiative corrections to the radiative tail. So if you look at the K factor is NNLO over leading order. That doesn't make any sense if there's no leading order. So that's just that this blob here, and then it stops. So you can't talk about the corrections on the radiative tail because they're infinite. But then you start doing corrections to the radiative tail, and that's what NNLO means. So you do corrections to the radiative tail, and now they are percentage. So if you're somewhere here and you want to measure this tail or something, you have percent corrections on that if you don't do NNLO. And so if you don't do next to leading order. Otherwise, you have a and you can't use next to leading order to estimate this because there's no leading order to compare to. So if you normally say, okay, well, it's alpha over pi times log something or other, what do you compare to? There's nothing. There's no leading order thing to compare to argue. Oh yeah, it's perturbation theory. Like it's small. Who cares? So you need to do these calculations. That's what I'm saying. Miona scattering. I'm not going to talk about why you care because we've heard why you care. Why you care is PRAD. The massless two loop is known since over 20 years. There have been a number of NNLO calculations and a number of generators. And in McMule, we do it at NNLO using NTS stabilization next to soft and massification, stuff Adrian spoke about, so I'm not gonna. We've validated this by comparing to E plus E minus to E plus E minus, so Epa scattering, and we've compared to a code called Baba Yaga, which is NNLO plus Proton shower. And we have two indistinguishable particles, so we define a narrow and a wide electron depending on what their scattering angle is, and this is what you get. You have extremely high corrections in the tail of NNLO, even NNLO coefficients. This is NNLO, and sorry, this is NNLO, and if you're far enough in the tail, you get 10% NNLO. Now you would say, sorry, you don't want to measure there because the cross section is tiny. That's fine, but if you do, then you have 10% NNLO corrections. So you need this. More closer to home, 5 per mil corrections. PRAD is a precision experiment, so you're probably going to need this sort of stuff. I'm going to quickly flash a bunch of other things that we are doing, and most of these things aren't completely done yet, so none of these things have references. Electroweak effects. If we go to high energy, so Bell or eventually FCC, maybe, you're going to need electroweak effects, and this is an example for Bell, 10.5 GeV center of mass energy. It's EE to tau tau, and electroweak effects start to matter. That's the orange curve here, and they start to become. I mean, that they're not as important as the next to leading order QD, but they matter. And if we want to do precision for that, we need to do this sort of stuff. Oh, sorry. This plot is again one of that suffered from my reformatting my slides. We do other things as well. We look at E-nu scattering, for example, for Dune, and they want to measure the sine theta this way, and flux uncertainties and whatnot. I don't have time to go through that, but like we do this as well. And finally, I want to briefly mention this plot because I think it's really cool. This is the best possible spectrum for the muon decay. It's the world record, I suppose, for knowing the muon decay, and it's about 10 to the minus. It's a very few 10 to the minus 5 theoretical uncertainty, and this is now as good a theoretical uncertainty as we're going to get in the near future, and it's an actual estimate of an uncertainty, not just hand waving until the hands fall off. Of what the uncertainty is, and we care about this for out searches and whatever. I don't care about that, doesn't matter here. With this, I want to show again the list of people who work on this sort of thing. These are people who at some point have or are working on McMule, and on behalf of McMule, I would like to thank you for your attention.